Gaggle will be challenged and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and apologies for the somewhat late start. I mean, I know we always start late, but today I had some really unfortunate technical issues. So, apologies, but also expressions of gratitude for those who have waited patiently for the issues to be resolved. Really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And obviously, there are a few things that we need to get to. You know, sometime earlier today, we had the familiar routine of an article from Axios suggesting that we are indeed close to some kind of an agreement between the United States and Iran, including a memorandum of understanding. And of course, as the, the story is reported, it's not a bad deal, I think, all round. But and so therefore it's likely to be attacked. Somebody said Kier sabotaging Georgia's connection. Yes, two-tier Kier has real problems with me. And of course, there's also a new government here in Budapest, and that's a whole problem in itself, which I hope to come to later on in this live stream. But anyway, here was the Axios story that launched the latest speculation. Here it is. So, you can see here that, yeah, U.S. and Iran reach deal but need Trump's final approval. Officials say, and then U.S. and Iranian negotiators have reached an agreement on a 60-day memorandum of understanding to extend the ceasefire and launch negotiations on Iran's nuclear program. But President Trump has yet to give his final approval, and then it goes on. The signing of the memorandum would be the most significant diplomatic breakthrough since the war started, but a final agreement that tackles Trump's nuclear demands would still require further intensive negotiations. This is an agreement to get everybody to the table. We will work out the details in the negotiations. And then U.S. officials said the terms of the deal were mostly agreed to as of Tuesday, but both sides still needed approval from senior leadership. U.S. officials claimed the Iranians later came back and said they had the necessary approvals and were prepared to sign. Iran has not confirmed this. U.S. negotiators briefed Trump on the details of the final deal, but he did not immediately sign off. The president relayed to the media he wants a couple of days to think about it. And then U.S. officials said the 60-day memorandum of understanding will state that shipping through the Strait of Hormuz will be unrestricted. A U.S. official said this means no tolls and no harassment, and that Iran will have to remove all mines from the strait within 30 days. Okay, but the U.S. naval blockade will also be lifted, but that will happen in proportion to the restoration of commercial shipping. And then the U.S. would also issue some sanctions waivers to allow Iran to sell oil freely. And the memorandum will also include an Iranian commitment not to pursue a nuclear weapon. It will also state that the first issues to be negotiated during the 60-day window will be how to dispose of Iran's highly enriched uranium and how to address Iranian enrichment. The U.S. will commit to discuss sanctions relief and the release of frozen uranium funds as part of the negotiations. The memorandum will also include a discussion of the mechanism to help Iran start receiving goods and humanitarian aid. The memorandum would also state that the war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon would end, an issue on which Trump and Netanyahu have had at least one tense discussion. And then the Times the story is a little more wary about whether there really is a deal, and says U.S. officials are closing in on a framework for negotiations with Iran that could extend the ceasefire, lead to the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and set the table and so on. And Mr. Trump has not signed off on the emerging framework, and it was not clear if it matched Iran's understanding. The development was the latest twist in a week that began with US and Iranian officials signaling progress in talks. Then saw military skirmishes. Obviously, we've had a few of those. Even as U.S. and Iranian officials acknowledged, negotiators had agreed to a draft memorandum. White House officials provided only a vague outline of what they had agreed to, at least preliminarily. The details are part of a memorandum, and so on. While the Strait of Hormuz will be reopened under the framework and Iran see some economic relief, the fate of Iran's nuclear program would be pushed to another round of negotiations. The Trump administration has demanded Iran to disavow that program and agree to dispose of its highly enriched uranium. So you get a sense of where this is going. As I've said, and I said last weekend that I was cautiously optimistic, simply because it's clear that Trump has realized that this is an almighty cock up. This whole war in Iran isn't going to go well. Iran is not going to be brought to its knees. That he had suffered terrible hubris and allowed himself to be persuaded by Netanyahu in the way that his predecessors, which included Obama and Biden and Clinton and Bush, none of them had been persuaded by Netanyahu that hitting Iran would deliver a knockout blow against would or rather hitting Iran's leadership would deliver a knockout blow and the regime would collapse. So that was the Netanyahu thesis. We remember former Defense Secretary and CIA Director Robert Gates, saying, "Yeah, that's what Netanyahu tried to persuade us of, and we weren't buying it." And of course, that's quite right. You can kill Iran's top leadership off, but that doesn't bring the regime to an end. I think Trump has realized this. Trump wants to get out of this, and obviously, he wants to come up with a deal that he can present as an improvement on the JCPOA, that which shouldn't be that difficult to do. But of course, he already had a deal that was an improvement on the JCPOA in February. So, but nonetheless, he launched this. He thought this was going to be a walk in the park. It didn't prove to be the such. So he can get a deal that would be an improvement on the JCPOA. However, it's he's he's been forced to see the Gulf states get a pounding, and these Gulf states, but the Gulf states in particular had now taken a real pounding, and that therefore the future security arrangement in the Gulf will be much more problematic for the United States than it had been in the past. So that's a consequence of this war, because what this Iran's attacks on the U.S. allies in the Gulf has demonstrated is their vulnerability. These U.S. allies had been under the impression that their alliance with the United States was a guarantee of their security. No one would mess with them because the United States backing. And of course, they still have the United States backing, but nonetheless, they've taken a pounding. And they're obviously going to reconsider their arrangements in the future. So so that's a negative. So yes, Trump can say, "I got a deal that is an improvement on the JCPOA." Iran is going to have to, you know, dismantle its nuclear program. Iran will have no, there won't be the sunset clause as there was in the JCPOA, and basically Iran will agree not to store any nuclear material in the country, whatever um, nuclear material it produces through the enrichment process will have to be shipped out of the country. And so that's that that he will have agreed to. He said, that which after all was a little different from the JCPOA, because in the JCPOA they still would store some nuclear material in the country. Now they would be shipped out. Um, that he will say that he's accomplished that. However, on the negative side, um, the U.S. allies in the Gulf will have been shown to be very vulnerable, and in the in any future confrontations with Iran, and they're obviously going to come. There will be future confrontations with Iran, given Israel, given also Israel's influence in the United States, and given that in the coming election campaign, Iran will play a prominent part, and Democrats and Republicans will be screaming that we have to do something about Iran. Iran poses an existential threat to the United States, to U.S. allies, and above all, of course, to Israel. Um, so that that's obviously going to come into the future. But for the time being, Trump will have got himself out of the out of this mess, and that I think is all Trump is really seeking to do, because this it has terrible economic consequences for the world, and you know, the actual strategic goals that the United States had set itself, which is essentially to knock the regime out, and then reorganize the Persian Gulf in accordance with U.S. wishes. That hasn't been accomplished, and it is, as I said before, it is to Trump's credit that once he has realized that his original goals were not achievable, he has decided to back away, at least for the time being, and then let whoever comes after him said, "Well, you deal with the Iranian problem." Um, so that's the situation. But of course, we'd have to see what happens in the future. I mean, of course, there are all the skeptics who say, "Oh no, this is Trump is going to relaunch the war against Iran and any day now. That this is really quite." It's all a distraction, fake news, and that the United States is getting ready to hit Iran. I don't think so. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't think he's going to do that. I think he's trying to get himself out of this. What I think is, also I think is quite a possibility, is that the United States isn't actually going to fulfill any of those obligations, and that while I think the blockade the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, the blockade of the blockade. I think all that will be lifted, because I think it's in everybody's interest to get oil moving out of the Strait of Hormuz. It's in Iran's interest, in the U.S. interest, it's in the Persian Gulf states' interest to get ships moving, oil moving out. Um, I don't think the U.S. is going to lift any sanctions, and you know the return of Iran's frozen assets. I don't see that happening. I think it's one of those things. The U.S. promises that, but I don't think it's likely to happen. But I also don't think that Iran will want to restart anything. I don't think that's the notion that they now want to keep this war going because they've seen their power. Because it makes no sense. Iran wants to ship its oil out. I mean, it's a real problem. I mean, they're running out of storage space in Iran and off the Iranian coast. All the various tankers off the Iranian coast, they're just running out of storage space. And so if you run out of storage space, then you can't go on producing oil. I mean, if you can't go on producing oil, then essentially the oil fields are shut down, and that becomes a real problem. So Iran wants to get its oil out, and so Iran wants to get the Strait of Hormuz lifted. I think the Americans want that, and the Persian Gulf states want that. However, I don't think the sanctions are really going to be lifted. It, I mean, when you get to the United States, it never lifts sanctions. I mean, it's just they're there in perpetuity. It's like Jackson Vanik. This went on from the 1970s. It went on decade after decade, long after the Soviet Union had disappeared. Jackson Vanik remained in place, and then and even when it seems like Jackson Vanik is going to be removed, back comes new sanctions against Russia. So it's just sanctions are never removed. Take one. You take off one set of sanctions, you insert another. All right, so that's I think on that front. Now, at the same time, we had the meetings that are going on in Europe, or rather in Cyprus, um, which dealing with this fascinating question, which is a really, something that is preoccupies the Europeans, which is how how do we get ourselves into the negotiations between Russia and the United States and Ukraine. So the Europeans want to have a presence, but they haven't quite figured out who exactly will represent the Europeans. And above all, they haven't figured out the much more important question is like, what exactly do they intend to do when they start negotiating? Because, of course, the European Union and most of the European states that matter, don't really want negotiations with Russia. They would much rather that the war continue. And they've actually been very, very annoyed that the Trump administration isn't as enthusiastic about this war as they are. And at every step of the way, ever since Trump returned, they they've been trying to stymie any possibility of serious negotiations. But nonetheless, there was a recent statement made by Antonio Costa, the president of the EU Council, that well, we need to be at the table. Then, Putin, if you recall, said, "Well, fine. If you're going to be at the table, how about you're represented by former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder." This was, of course, dismissed by the Europeans. But then the question is, well, who will represent Europe at the table? And that was then it was declared that Kaya Kallas said, "Well, Kaya Kallas, as the EU's foreign minister, I should represent the EU at the table," because the Russians said, "Well, we're not going to negotiate with the EU." Now, the meeting about that in Cyprus discussed, well, how are we going to get on the table? What's our negotiating position? Because as far as one can tell, the Europeans' position on the war is Russia just needs to withdraw. That's it. Russia just needs to withdraw from Ukraine, and then we'll talk. Um, so that's the one thing. Now the other thing is, if you recall, we were talking about this, in a number of our you know recent podcasts. We had the Ukraine using the airspace of the Baltic states um, in order to hit targets inside Russia, and then of course we had the Ukraine hitting the teachers training college in Lugansk. Um, over the weekend, and then Russia's response by using the Oreshnik, and then we had the statement, which we talked about on Tuesday, the statement by the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, warning that we're going to be launching some really serious attacks on Ukraine, and we're going to be hitting command and control centers. We're going to be hitting government buildings, and the foreign um, diplomats, foreign representatives had better leave. Um, they'd better leave Kiev. Now, the response of the Europeans to this threat was, of course, the familiar bluster and say, "We're not going anywhere. We're staying put. We're sticking with Ukraine through thick and thin. We're not leaving." And the one after another, they all, Germany, France, everybody, they all issued the statement. We're not going anywhere. We're staying here. Russia can threaten. We're not going to be intimidated by Russia. And then somebody put out the rumor that the United States had agreed to withdraw its diplomats from Kiev. I think there was no. This was a rumor, but one source of the rumor was clearly Kaya Kallas, who seemed to say, well, because she's of course, detests the United States. She's spoken out, a number of times about how the United States doesn't respect us, and Kaya Kallas, who wants no negotiation whatsoever with Russia, is very, very annoyed that the United States has no issue at all with talking to Russia. And so she stated that while we Europeans had all stuck by Ukraine and said absolutely unambiguously that we are not going anywhere. We're not going to be intimidated by Russia. Our diplomats are staying put. She suggested that, to the contrary, the United States had agreed with Russia to withdraw its diplomats from Kiev. And so, therefore, this turned out to be not true, but nonetheless, it's another one of those stories that Kaya Kallas likes to put out. Anyway, she gave this um, news conference uh, earlier today, and it's kind of worth taking a look at what she said. And here they have this. Here she is. Said there. Well, first of all, she was asked this question about what's going to be the EU's negotiating position. I mean, if you want to get to the negotiating table, what exactly will you be negotiating? And so there's a question: what would be the point of substance? What would be the most important points of inaudible? And then I put forward a paper already in February, listing all of them that I could come up with, starting from Russia, actually respecting the international agreements that they have taken, the obligation not to attack their neighbors and respect their sovereignty. But of course, there are other things, for example, mirroring the concessions that have been asked from Ukraine regarding military limitation, for example, that this should also be mirrored then to Russia if it is in this agreement. And of course, there are also questions that are of wider concern. If you think about Russian troops in countries like Georgia, Moldova, that is also in the European security interest that these troops are not there and that they are not meddling with elections in different countries. So, of course, it's a maximalist approach, but so is Russia's approach so far, representing the maximalist claims. So there she is. She said this before, that Russia should basically withdraw its forces from Moldova, which they're not in Moldova, they're in Transnistria, which is a largely Russian inhabited province in Moldova. And of course there's this, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, two parts of Georgia that clearly never wanted to be a part of Georgia, and Russia has actually recognized their independence. But I mean, they're not going to be returned to Georgia because maybe basically Abkhazians and South Ossetians do not want to be a part of Georgia. All these republics were created somewhat arbitrarily by the Bolsheviks as part of their divide and rule strategy. And then, of course, when the dissolution of the Soviet Union, each of these republics retained the borders, the very arbitrary borders that they had within the USSR. So therefore, people found themselves now outside of the USSR, but living in republics that they didn't want to be a part of. And I think that was the problem with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But the Europeans, and of course, and the Americans, for obvious reasons, wanted to retain the the borders of the USSR's 15 republics, because that was by retaining those borders, that was disadvantageous to Russia, because now that large numbers of Russians now found themselves outside of the borders of Russia, and of course all sorts of minorities now who were content to be living in these republics, but as long as they were part of the USSR, now found themselves outside of the USSR, and some and persecuted minorities within those republics. But so the EU's position has been that somehow all of the borders of the republics as they were in the Soviet Union must be respected and must be retained, irrespective of the desires of the people who were living in those republics. So that's why the European and American position is still, well, we must, we recognize Georgia within its international frontiers, even though those international frontiers were drawn up by Stalin and for his own of political reasons. Um, but anyway, so that's why Kaya Kallas says, well, the Russians should just withdraw from Georgia. They should withdraw from Moldova. That's in addition to, of course, withdrawing from Ukraine. And then here this goes on. Um, this when she was asked this question about the diplomats that Russia said, well, I mean, you see, Russia was not threatened. They weren't actually threatening the diplomats. They're saying, well, we're going to be start doing some serious bombing of Kiev government ministries, of Kiev's command and control centers, and it could be that foreigners, and here the reference was much more with those NATO personnel who were aiding Ukraine, that, well, they might get killed in these attacks. So rather than diplomats as such, Russia wasn't saying we're going to hit the embassies. Obviously, they're not going to hit the embassies, but they were saying that those diplomatic personnel who are engaged in working with the Ukrainian military, assisting with the Ukrainian military, providing weapons training and satellite intelligence and so on, those people might be in danger of attack. Anyway, so here's they were asked. Russia was threatening again Europe and Kiev, saying also that diplomatic personnel should leave from Kiev. How do you characterize this threat? And then, should we fear or something? And then she says, well, this is what Russia does because it is not really gaining ground on the battlefield. So what they are doing now is really increasing the terrorist attacks, because you cannot really describe it in other ways, creating fear inside the society. It has not worked for 4 years, but I do not think that it is going to work now. Also, what we heard from Ukraine yesterday was that all embassies stayed. And you see this star here, or this asterisk rather. So it also takes courage from these embassies, but yes, all the Europeans stayed. Now, it says here with the asterisk updated with a correction with regard to the diplomatic presence in Kiev. So what they mean there with this correction is that she had said that the Europeans stayed, but the Americans said that they would leave. And of course, that actually isn't true. But Kaya Kallas declared, oh, the Americans decided to withdraw their diplomats in the face of these Russian threats. So that was her initial statement. She was the one who put out this story that the Americans had agreed to withdraw, which simply wasn't true, as far as we know. Because that's what the Americans said, that isn't true, and then but she has been going around, shooting her her mouth off, and see again, yeah. And so she gave an interview to Der Spiegel, and Der Spiegel again asked that very question of, well, what are you going to actually talk about? What are you going to negotiate? And this question is like, well, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel recently said she would like to see more diplomatic engagement from Europe. Are you doing too little? And then Carla said, well, I prepared a paper back in February and presented it to the foreign ministers. What do we need to discuss in the event of negotiation with Russia? So far, pressure has primarily been exerted on Ukraine to make concessions, even though Russia is the problem. Unfortunately, we haven't seen any credible signs from the Russian side that Moscow actually wants to negotiate. Putin isn't budging from his maximalist demands. And then, and here with Euro News, and then she says, EU will never be a neutral mediator between Ukraine and Russia. And then the High Representative has dismissed the Baza special envoy for talks with Russia, arguing the EU will never be a neutral mediator between Moscow and Kosovo. We have been clearly on Ukraine's side. She says this. We've clearly been on Ukraine's side. Um, and then there's gone. One thing is very clear: Europe will never be a neutral mediator between Russia and Ukraine because we are on Ukraine's side, and we are defending our own security interests. We can't be neutral, treating them equally because we have been clearly on Ukraine's side. Ukraine, she argued, needs the EU to rebalance the negotiations and extract concessions from the Russian side. All our efforts have been complementary to the US efforts, and the ministers are very clear about this. We are not coming in instead of the United States, but we are actually addressing the issues that they haven't been addressing in these talks. So, to get through to this, it's clear that that the Europeans have no interest in any kind of negotiations. All of this talk about, oh, we're going to we need a place at the table. Oh, and we're not really happy with the Americans. We need to do something in addition to the Americans. All of that is really completely beside the point, because what Gagglers makes clear here, when she says, "Well, we're neutral mediators." Well, of course, no one suggested that you're going to be neutral mediators, but they had to present. The Europeans had to present to the European public that they were serious about negotiations. So they had to show that, well, we're serious about negotiations. We need a place at the table. We want to be. We need to be. They need to take part in these talks. Okay, and then you say, well, fine. Well, what are you going to say? What do you want to contribute into these talks? Well, of course, then they don't want to contribute, and she kind of blurts this out. Well, we're on Ukraine's side. We're not neutral. We are on Ukraine's side. Well, okay. Well, if you're on Ukraine's side, then what exactly will you contribute during these talks? Well, they know they don't want to contribute anything. I mean, Kaya Carlos makes that clear. They don't have anything to contribute. The European goal is to keep this war going, but the European public is kind of getting a little tired of this because it is costing a lot of money, and uh, and the results don't seem to justify the cost. Now, for Callas and Merz and Macron, they think the results do justify the cost because they see that the result, which is to weaken Russia, maybe with a view to bringing about a collapse in Russia, bringing about a revolt inside Russia, an uprising in Russia, a breakup of Russia. I mean, that's what they plan. That they think, well, it's worth it. Let's just keep pouring in more money. Let's keep this war going. As long as Ukraine doesn't collapse, well, weakening Russia, killing Russians, well, that's a good investment. But you can't really sell that as a policy to Europe. I mean, it's just the European public isn't going to be impressed. They're going to say, well, hey, that doesn't sound like a very smart policy. I mean, we need the money ourselves. Just weakening Russia and inflicting pain on Russia, killing as many Russians as possible. That doesn't sound like a particularly sound European sound like a policy. And of course, it's in violation of the EU's own grand commitments that it believes in peace and the Treaty of the European Union. We can probably talk about that another time. Is filled with sonorous declarations that the whole project of the European Union is directed towards peace, directed towards supporting the UN Charter. And of course, that isn't true. Everything they do is the exact opposite. But nonetheless, that's the babble that Europe regales us with. So they think this is, well, that's that's well worth the cost. But at various times, and particularly since Trump's return to power, they've felt the obligation to pretend that they are indeed interested in peace. And so say, yeah, we want to be in negotiations. And then they say, oh, well, Putin's not ready to negotiate. Then they say, well, but what's funny about that, when they always say this, well, we've seen this already today with Kaya Kallas, well, Putin's not ready to negotiate, is, well, how do you know, since you haven't bothered to try to negotiate? And of course, even on his face, it is untrue, because, of course, Russia was negotiating, in it sought to come to some kind of an agreement with the Europeans, with NATO, with the United States in December of 2021. And then, of course, in the spring of 2022, again, it tried to negotiate something. But nonetheless, Europe does not wish to negotiate. Um, anyway, so here's Carlos. Uh, so as Carlos said, you focus on articulating a common position that lays out the concessions that Russia should make at the negotiating table. So they're laying out the concessions that Russia should make at the negotiating table. And concessions that they know Russia isn't going to make. I mean, essentially, you're asking Russia to capitulate. Well, okay, you can do that, but you need to have then done a little more to force a capitulation. Just simply demanding whether they capitulate, that isn't going to get you anywhere. So that's it. They should make at the negotiating table the conditions that should be met and the red lines that should not be crossed. So it's just lots of, Russia should do this, this, and this. That's the the EU's position. And then this is when she says these would include non-recognition of Russian occupied territories. So in other words, withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine. Okay, well, that you kind of have to, if you're going to do that, you are going to have to get yourself directly involved in this war, and that means you're going to have to send your troops in there, because Ukraine does not have the strength to achieve that, to push the Russians out. The cessation of sabotage operations, so the familiar type accusations against Russia: cessation of sabotage operations, cyber attacks, election interference, and airspace violations. The payment of reparations. So Russia then, okay, so then now Russia has to pay reparation. That's presumably part of the frozen frozen 200 billion euros that Kaya Kallas is obviously wants to get her hands on. Payment of reparations, the return of abducted Ukrainian children, that old chestnut, the release of journalists, and the withdrawal of Russian troops from Georgia and Moldova. So that's quite a shopping list that Kaya Kallas puts forward. And then you say, well, okay, well, you're putting that forward, and then you demand a place at the negotiating table. Well, obviously, she is afraid that Trump might just go along with some kind, try to work out a deal with Russia, and that's really the European fear, which is, why are they so anxious to get to the negotiating table? They've got to come up with a person to represent the Europeans. Well, they're afraid that the United States might work something out with Russia. And Russia has repeatedly said, "Oh, the spirit of Anchorage. We had some kind of an agreement in place, and so on." And I've always expressed some skepticism of that, because there's never been any indication from the American side, from anything Trump said, that they were close to an agreement with Russia. I think Trump would like to get this war over and done with, but I just don't think that he was ever um, willing to make the kind of concessions that that the Russians would want. So that's why I think that the spirit of Anchorage was always been um, more a Russian Russian wishful thinking than anything else. And even in Anchorage, the meeting really didn't last very long. If you recall, they had a discussion, and then some kind of a meal was laid on for the American side and the Russian side jointly, but no one ate anything. The Russians went home, then the Americans went home, so there was no partaking of lunch at Anchorage. So I don't think it was ever really much of an agreement that could have been signed. But in any case, it didn't really matter because the Europeans rushed to Washington to persuade Trump to don't whatever you do, don't do it, don't sign anything with the Russians. But anyway, but nonetheless, I think this is a perpetual um, source of anxiety for Kaya Kallas and the Europeans that maybe Trump is going to sign something with Putin. And then, so limitations on Russia's ability to rearm should also be considered, Kallas said, particularly if the peace deal caps the size of the Ukrainian army. And then, and this is what I want to show. This was the response of the U.S. Embassy to the claim that somehow there was an agreement to withdraw American diplomats from Kiev. And says the U.S. Embassy is open. There are no changes to our operations, and reports to the contrary are untrue. The reports that were coming from Kaya Kallas. For the State Department, there is no higher priority than the safety and protection of U.S. citizens, so we regularly review the security situation at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. We reiterate once again that U.S. citizens should not travel to Ukraine for any reason due to the armed conflict. And then here is the independent story about this, how this came up, the story that was doing the rounds. And remember yesterday, if you listened to the podcast that we did with Gilbert Doctorow, suggested that, well, the Europeans are staying in Kiev, but the Americans have agreed to withdraw, which I think isn't true. But Independent says, well, why did the American diplomats leave Ukraine? And embassy response sparks new questions. And then confusion arose after some Ukrainian media cited remarks by Kaya Kallas. Speaking on the sidelines of an EU meeting in Cyprus, Kallas indicated that all foreign embassies in Kiev had disregarded Moscow's threats except one. She stated, what we heard from Ukraine yesterday was that all the embassies stayed except one. All the Europeans stayed, Americans left. So it was so you see, Kallas was the one who put the story out that everybody, all the Europeans stayed, but the Americans left. I mean, that's part of her general animus towards Trump and the United States. They're insufficiently on board with Ukraine, insufficiently hostile towards Russia. This prompted several EU states to summon Russian ambassadors after the warning was issued on Monday. We talked about that. And however, Dmitry Litvin, communications advisor to the Ukrainian President Zelensky, told reporters that Ukraine had received information that some American diplomats had indeed departed Kiev during the Russian strike on Sunday. Litvin expressed gratitude to all embassies that continue their work in Kiev and support Ukraine, and then so on. So that's but this is Kallas, which is constantly on tenterhooks that somehow Trump might not be on board with her project. Anyway, one project that uh, that the EU and the United States are indeed in agreement on is to get Pashinyan, Nikol Pashinyan, over the finish line in the parliamentary elections scheduled for, I think, June the 7th, which is not this Sunday, but the following Sunday. Now, so there's a remarkable congruence between the Americans and the Europeans to ensure that Pashinyan is victorious. So remember, Pashinyan was cultivated poor relations with Russia, and therefore has become the kind of the darling of the West. He he's in some trouble in the election. And we talked a couple of weeks ago about the big European political community meeting. You mean the European political community is the brainchild of Emmanuel Macron. You remember there was a big European political community meeting in Yerevan, and following that, there was a big EU Armenia meeting. EU and Armenia signed this agreement, the EU Armenia strategic partnership, and so on. But now it's Trump's term to get in on the Armenia issue, because of course Armenia is going to be the location of the big transport communications hub that's going to be built, connecting the two parts of Azerbaijan. So you got the Azerbaijan proper, and of course the Azerbaijani exclave, the Nakhchivan, and that's going to be the trip, the Trump the Trump uh, transportation hub, and Trump needs Pashinyan to win there, to ensure that this gets off the ground. So after that warm, ringing endorsement that Pashinyan got from the Europeans, you remember there was Macron and Pashinyan, danced together and so on. But now Trump has sent out this very, very warm, enthusiastic truth, in which here he says, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan of Armenia, a great friend and leader, is making his country strong, wealthy, and very secure. Nikol completely shares my vision of peace and prosperity for Armenia and the entire South Caucasus region. Our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, just traveled to Armenia, where he advanced several important deals for both our countries. Soon, the United States and Armenia will break ground together on the Trump route for international peace and prosperity. That's the transportation hub, which will transform the South Caucasus and help our wonderful American energy companies gain access from Central Asia and all the way to the United States. And then for these reasons, Nikol has my complete and total endorsement for re-election on June the 7th. With Nikol's help, we will bring the United States, Armenia, the South Caucasus, and Central Asia to greater heights than ever before. And then just the day before, as Trump pointed out, Marco Rubio was in Yerevan and signing this agreement for the trip framework, and then also the strategic partnership charter and the critical mineral memorandum of understanding. So lots and lots of agreements that are being signed between the United States and Pashinyan. And then here's Rubio, thanking everybody and says it's a courageous path towards peace in the South Caucasus, solidified in Washington on the 8th of August last year. And so I was honored to join the foreign minister here to this bilateral agreement. And then here, this agreement marks the biggest step to date on making this historic route a reality, on advancing peace, and on increasing prosperity in Armenia, and frankly, on the region. But our relationship is not simply limited to TRIP. We are building upon that in so many different ways, and it's a top priority of this administration. And then, the president personally takes tremendous pride in TRIP, not simply in that, but in all of the other things we are continuing to build on. It's going to be an important part of his legacy in the second term as president, and we're here to continue to work on that, which is why today, by renewing the Strategic Partnership Charter, it's an opportunity to outline the future of the U.S.-Armenia bilateral relationship, creating a new path for partnership and economic opportunity for Armenians and for Americans. Now, there's something kind of interesting about this because what Trump and the United States are doing, I mean, is they're going to try and make a lot of money here. Whether they do or not, that's a different issue. But they want to make a whole lot of money. They think there's going to be huge uh, boom in economic activity once this transportation hub is built, because it means that now there's a clear path from Europe through Turkey via Armenia into Azerbaijan, the Caucasus, and into Central Asia. So, in other words, it's going to be the European path into Central Asia and essentially a kind of a transatlantic path to surrounding China. In other words, to incorporate the various Central Europeans, not the Central European, the Central Asian countries, and China's various economic partners into you know the transatlantic system. That's why they think this is really the beginning of of a push towards I guess surrounding China with with NATO, EU states, and particularly all under American leadership. So it's very much and I think there's going to be a lot of money in this. So it's that's how he sees it. Now, the European perspective was a little bit different because the Europeans they only like Armenia because that's just somehow it's against Russia. But you break up the friendship, the alliance between Russia and Armenia, I mean, which obviously goes back centuries, and that's about all there is to it. It's very much it complements everything that the Europeans had been doing in Ukraine, which is, well, hey, Ukraine used to be an ally and partner of Russia's. Hey, now we're going to scoop it up, and it's going to be our ally and partner, and therefore, the Russians will be much diminished. And as you know, and as we've discussed before, this was very much a part of this big new Brzezinski doctrine. He wrote about this in his book, The Grand Chessboard, that once you take Ukraine away from Russia, then Russia is much diminished. So as he wrote, I think Russia and Ukraine together, that's a formidable power, and that's a serious geopolitical entity. Once Russia no longer has Ukraine, then Russia is much weaker and much more vulnerable. So as far as the Europeans goes, well, fine. Then we're gonna scoop up Ukraine, and then we want to basically scoop up Armenia. So Armenia is very small, but it is strategic location. As, of course, is Georgia, which, of course, they also, the Americans and the Europeans, worked to incorporate within their strategic structures, as and of course under Saakashvili, and for you'll recall in 2008 when NATO made its famous commitment to Ukraine, which is Ukraine will be a member of NATO. I mean, that went together with Georgia. Ukraine and Georgia will both be members of NATO. And that, of course, triggered Saakashvili's the attack on South Ossetia, because according to the the NATO conditions for membership application, you can't have conflicts on your territory. And so Georgia had these open conflicts on its territory, with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Saakashvili, given this promise in April 2008 that you will be a member of NATO, decided he was going to take matters into his own hands and end the conflict on his territory. And so he launched his attack on South Ossetia. That, of course, turned into a complete disaster for him, and it began the decline of his presidency. But the point is that all of this is a part of a kind of a grand chess game with Russia. So all of these territories and all of these republics that had been a part of the USSR, the goal is to take them outside of Russia's sphere of influence and scoop them up into the West sphere of influence. And so that's the importance of Armenia. With Trump, I mean, there's some money involved. He thinks that he's going to make a lot of money on building this Trump road to peace and prosperity. So it's a kind of the two complement each other. I mean, Macron, who was hugging and kissing Pashinyan, I mean, he's not thinking commercially. He thinks, great, we've got Armenia. That's a real humiliation for Russia, and now they're on board, and so this is chalk that up as one for our side. Now, the last thing any of these powers are concerned with is, of course, the welfare of Armenians. I mean, they don't really care. It's just a piece on the jigsaw. I mean, a piece on the chessboard. And Brzezinski, I think, was very was very, very truthful when he called his book, the grand chessboard. It's just these countries just exist as pieces on the chessboard. Hey, we're fighting. We're taking on Russia. We're taking on China. We got to take these pieces off the chessboard so that they're, therefore we can defeat Russia or China. And then that's more or less how the Europeans and the United States think of Armenia, which is a very small country. It's country of 3 million, but they're paying a great deal of attention to it because now they've decided that the future of all their dreams, whether to make money, as in the case of Trump and his entourage, or to defeat and humiliate Russia, all depends on the fate of Pashinyan. So they're obsessively interested in what's going to happen in this election on June the 7th. And so here's this Rubio talking, and then so on, and then anyway. But the problem arises that the Russians are really quite pissed off by this because they feel, well, we have these economic relations with with Armenia, in which out of which Armenia does rather well. This is part of their kind of Eurasian Economic Union, and if Armenia wants to make nice with the EU and wants to make an application to join the EU, well, obviously, it can't continue to be a member of our economic bloc. And then, obviously, I mean, it's common sense that if you're in one free trade area, you can't very well be inside another free trade area, because then they, that's going to undermine the purpose of one or other of those free trade areas. And of course, that was the situation in the case of Ukraine, when when Viktor Yanukovych was contemplating signing the EU association agreement. He was told by Russia, well, if you're going to be a part of the EU free trade area, you can't go on then being a part of the Russian free trade area, because otherwise, then essentially Russia would be have a free trade agreement with the EU, and therefore the EU would just simply wipe out Russia's domestic industries. And so something similar is being made clear to Pashinyan. Well, if you want to make nice with the Europeans, I mean, you keep signing all these agreements, then you can't go on enjoying this privileged, standing with the Eurasian Economic Unions. You can't go on enjoying this the beneficial rates that you get, and the access to our markets, and above all, the cheap oil and gas that you get from Russia. And so Russians are now starting to apply some pressure against Armenia. I mean, we know that the Europeans and the Americans would have long ago have applied this kind of pressure against anyone who dared to cross them. I mean, remember the pressure that the EU had applied against Hungary, which is a member state. They basically cut off funds to Hungary, because they didn't like Hungary's domestic policy. Just basically cut off funds that Hungary was entitled to, and the Europeans got onto Ukraine and tried to ensure that Ukraine stopped delivering Russian oil that Hungary had paid for, that Ukraine would stop delivering Russian oil to Hungary. So that's the kind of pressure the EU is willing to apply. So, but everyone is kind of shocked and outraged when Russia also starts applying pressure. Well, if Pashinyan's going to pursue policies that are hostile toward Russia, then Pashinyan can't go on expecting the favorable trade terms that Armenia has enjoyed for decades. So here's the story from that the Russia's Federal Service for Veterinary and Phytosanitary Surveillance, and they said Roselkhoznadzor has restricted the import of fruit and vegetable products from Armenia, from May the 30th. In other words, from tomorrow, or from Saturday, that basically they're not going to have their then privileged access to the Russian market. So here with Roselkhoznadzor will impose temporary restrictions on the import of fresh tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, green vegetables, and strawberries originating and shipped from Armenia starting May the 30th, until an appropriate algorithm for ensuring the safety of shipped products is developed. The decision was made due to the increasing number of violations in the supply of Armenian fruit and vegetable products to Russia and to ensure phytosanitary safety. Phytosanitary is what it's it deals with the health to plants. The current situation poses a threat to the phytosanitary status of the country. And then, moreover, the competent Armenian agency did not take appropriate measures regarding previously identified violations. And then, in accord with the previously reached agreements, Rosel Khoznadzor conducted an inspection of Armenian enterprises during which a number of violations were identified, namely in the presence of quarantine facilities for the Eurasian Economic Union member states in greenhouse complexes and so on. And then also, according to the data, large quantity of fruit and vegetable products is supplied by numerous American foreign trade partnerships with unknown ownership structures who evade quarantine phytosanitary inspections. Um, uh, and anyway, so that's that. And now those, I think, cut flowers. There's been a restriction on imports of cut flowers from Armenia. And then here's again, this is a story from the Moscow Times, and says, while Rossel Khoznadzor cited safety concerns, claiming it documented 181 cases of contaminated Armenian produce so far this year, the move is likely political in nature, as Russian authorities recently suspended the import of flowers and the sale of some Armenian alcoholic products in Russian stores. At the same time, Russia this week threatened to rip up a 2013 bilateral agreement guaranteeing Armenia duty free natural gas and oil if it continues to pursue closer relations with the EU. And then this is Pashinyan shrugged off the energy threats. He argued that EU membership would eventually bring in far more money than Armenia would lose from an increase in Russian natural gas prices. And then here, and then we have Reuters, which says Russia says Armenia could lose cheap gas if it turns away. And then Kremlin on Monday said Armenia could lose the very attractive price it pays for Russian gas if it turned away from integration with Russia ahead of this is before Rubio's visit. There is a very attractive and more than preferential price for Russian gas, Peskov said. But of course, such terms are not available to participants in other integration frameworks. Therefore, the pricing structure is entirely different. It's market-based. And then Maria Zaharova, she chimed in today and says it's clear that this policy of the Armenian authorities is eroding the mutually beneficial strategic partnership between our countries and creating the risk of Yerevan losing all the advantages it receives from it. Russia remains Armenia's leading economic and investment partner. As of 2025, Russia's share of Armenia's foreign trade was approximately 36%, up to 98% of Armenian agricultural exports, and almost 80% of strong alcoholic beverage exports go to the Russian market. All right, so you get the sense what that this is a kind of a problem for Armenia. Now, what that shows you, the Europeans and the Americans really couldn't care less. I mean, this is all a part of the kind of geopolitical chess game. So the fate of ordinary Armenians really matters very little. So if suddenly Armenia no longer has access to the Russian market, well, I don't know, it doesn't matter to us. Hey, Armenia no longer gets cheap oil and gas from Russia. I don't know, doesn't mean much to us. But it's also a disaster from the point of view of Armenians and the with Pashinyan, who's determined to continue with this policy because, as he says, oh well, whatever we lose, through no further access to the Russian market, no more cheap Russian energy. Well, whatever we lose, we're going to gain through membership of the EU. Now, I don't think that Armenia has the slightest chance of becoming a member of the EU anytime soon. Um, but what I think is quite possible that the Europeans will undertake, or the European Union will undertake, to underwrite Armenia, because this is part of the geopolitical game. So again, the European taxpayers are going to have to subsidize Armenia. So once Armenia no longer has cheap oil and gas, and once Armenia no longer has access to the Russian market, and once basically remittances, and that's a big source of income for Armenia, remittances from Armenians living in Russia dries up, then Armenia is going to be in some economic trouble. And then the Europeans are going to have to decide are you willing to lose Armenia to Russia? Because if there's a whole economic disaster in Armenia as a result of being cut out of the Russian sphere of influence, of all the economic consequences, well, then it's quite likely that Pashinyan's opponents are going to win the election. So you're going to have to whip out your checkbook. They're not going to get into the EU. That's out of the question. So you're going to have to come up with a lot of money to keep Armenia going. And Pashinyan kind of knows this, and he's essentially blackmailing the Europeans, which is hey, if you want to go on playing this game with Russia, if you want to humiliate Russia, we're going to need some money from you. And so here is some this is again from Russians, and here we have Bloomberg story: Russia is turning the screws on Armenia over its tilt to Europe, and here obviously saying Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's aspirations to join the European Union and engineer Armenia's most significant realignment since the collapse of the Soviet Union have exacerbated the situation. And then several opposition groups in the election want closer ties with Russia, including Strong Armenia Alliance led by Russian-American billionaire Samvel Karapetyan. And we've talked about him. He's essentially under arrest in Armenia. And then the Prosperous Armenia Party of Tycoon, Gaggle Tsarukyan, and the Armenia Alliance led by ex-President Robert Kocharyan. And then it says the Trump route for this is the trip, a transport and energy corridor linking Azerbaijan will give a U.S. a stake in the region, yet Armenia's attempt to distance itself from Moscow remains constrained by deep economic and structural dependence. Well, yes, it does, rather. And then, and so on. And then, but it says Armenian Foreign Minister Ararat Mirzoyan told reporters Tuesday that Yerevan isn't contemplating divorce from Russia and wants good relations with Moscow, even as it builds ties with the EU. We understand perfectly well, and we don't need Russia to tell us that membership in the EEU and membership in the EU are incompatible. When the moment comes to choose, we will make that decision. So you can see how that basically they're playing this game of how can we extract as much money as possible from the Europeans and the Americans, and what price are they willing to pay? And they're obviously they're going to be willing to pay a quite substantial price, because they say, well, if we don't, then we're going to lose Armenia. Armenia is going to go back into Russia's orbit. So all of our efforts will be for naught. And if Armenia moves back into Russia's orbit, then who knows who else might move back into Russia's orbit? We might lose Moldova. Horror. We might lose other states in Eastern Europe. So the Europeans, they cannot afford to lose anyone. Therefore, and of course, the Armenian leaders know this, and that's why they're playing this game of saying, well, hey, you want this to continue, you want us to stay in power, you want us to go on severing our ties step by step with Russia. Well, you're going to have to pay us, because that's costing us a lot of money. And so here, and then here's an interesting article in Foreign Policy by Kenneth Roth, who you may know was the longtime director of Human Rights Watch, executive director of Human Rights Watch, and he's, in a way, he's the sort of the master of the sort of the use of human rights in order to undermine other countries. You go, go to a country, and then you declare that, oh, Serbia, Georgia, Romania, whatever, they're not fulfilling their human rights obligations, and therefore they must be sanctioned. So they have to be sanctioned, and that's it's part of the tools of Western foreign policy making, which is that, well, we can use human rights very insincerely, but we can use human rights in order to undermine countries that we don't like, and to persuade Western powers to use sanctions, and maybe worse, against states that are deemed to be adverse to Western interests. Of course, it was used with great success against Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and Human Rights Watch was very, took a very active leading part in the use of human rights in order to undermine any kind of support for the Serbs, and therefore in using human rights in order to persuade Western powers to impose more and more sanctions against Yugoslavia. But anyway, Kenneth Roth has weighed in on Armenia, and makes some reasonable points about Pashinyan. So here it says, it is hardly surprising that US President Donald Trump is taking the wrong approach to the battle. Rather than pressing for free and fair elections, he is unconditionally backing the incumbent prime minister, who has increasingly sought to tilt the electoral playing field in his favor. However, it is deeply disappointing that European governments are following suit, abandoning the democratic process in the name of countering Russian influence efforts. This is ridiculous. I mean, since when have Europeans ever taken the idea of democracy seriously? Kenneth Roth knows that Moldova, thanks with assistance from the EU, Moldova basically has been eliminating democracy from the country, because, of course, the leader who was supported by the EU, Maya Sandu, has been step by step arresting her political opponents, putting her political opponents in prison, and essentially, removing all vestiges of democracy. I mean, the number of her political opponents who are in prison is is legion, and the Europeans have never said anything about that because they saw Maya Sandu as very useful. Hey, she's anti-Russian, so we can just say, oh, she's pro-Western and she's pro-democracy, and that's fantastic. So we need to support Maya Sandu, even though she basically is eliminating democracy from Moldova. So you ask, where the hell has Kenneth Roth been living all this time? And of course, we hardly need bring up the case of Romania, where also an election was canceled. Well, how did they cancel the election? Well, they just cried Russia. That's all you have to do. You just cry Russia, and an election is is canceled. But here, Van said, well, yeah, of course, that's the way it is with Trump. But I expected more from the Europeans. So, with 30% of voters undecided, according to the February poll, the election could go in any direction. If no contender produces a stable parliamentary majority on its own or in coalition within 6 days of the results, the vote will go to a second round. In that case, opposition parties could team up to beat Pashinyan. And then, it says, as I saw on a visit to Armenia in March, Pashinyan is pulling out all the stops to prevent his party's defeat. Using tactics from the autocratic playbook, his government has arrested opposition members and detained critical journalists. The prime minister is also undermining the independence of the judiciary and making unprecedented interventions into the workings of the Armenian Apostolic Church. Who'd have thunk? Pashinyan already dominates political coverage by Armenia's state-run media and is increasingly deploying state resources to surveil and hound the opposition. Vague crimes such as hooliganism, a classic Soviet-era offense, are being resurrected to silence critics, and so on. And then it goes away. Then he goes on. Um, Yet Pashinyan has figured out how to neutralize any European objection to his suppression of opposition voices. He claims to be combating Russian influence, and European leaders are buying it. Well, yeah, why wouldn't he have? That's exactly what the Europeans have been doing since forever. That's exactly what they do. They, they, how do you justify um, putting your opponents in prison? How do you justify, um, outlawing media that you don't like? How do you justify removing political parties that you don't like from the ballot? Well, you just say Russia, Russian interference, and the media happily repeat these allegations. Oh, yeah, 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 the Russians are interfering. They have to do that. The Russians are interfering. So this is what they did with Maya Sandu. Everybody knows that Maya Sandu was extremely unpopular, and, and there was no way she was ever going to win the election. So, hey, out comes the familiar cry, oh, Russian interference. The Europeans embrace Maya Sandu, and that was enough to get her over the finish line. So you think, well, where the hell has Kenneth Roth been all of this time, pretending? Well, he knew nothing about this. Um, anyway, so that's with Armenia, and let's then now go to our Gaggle locals page. This is our Gaggle community, uh, where this is the. Oh, let's see, yeah, I have to. Sorry, I have to. Uh, yeah, having some difficulties here. That's, I said I had some technical issues here, so I have to um, get into yeah, here. Let's see, what was it? Okay. Good. Okay, save. Okay, so here we are. Yeah. Okay, so now, all right. Well, yeah. So now I'm here with the was a little, as I say, I had these problems earlier. So anyway, here. So as I always say, if you want to uh, interact with me, if you want me to answer your questions, you want me to address your any issues you have, please join our community. It's great fun, and because I can't see all the comments made on YouTube. So anyway, here is Danaki, one of the our favorite contributors at the Gaggle. He says here, Danaki asks, so how is life under Mojo Peter regime so far? Have the milk and honey started flowing already? I know it's not clear when and how the funds will be unfrozen, but congrats on the decision to join the EU prosecutor's office. I foresee great success. Well, that's of course very interesting because one of the promises that Peter Maggio had to make in order to have any shot at getting any money out of the EU was that he would join this EU's prosecutor's office. And, and of course, it's all done with the view that he will prosecute with the help of the EU. Obviously, he will prosecute Viktor Orban, the people around Viktor Orban, um, for corruption. You know, whatever corruption means, but for whatever this is and um, and so the Orban government hadn't been a part of the this EU uh, prosecutor's office, but Mario Peter had to promise the EU, well, we are now going to join and we're going to take seriously corruption. And that means we are going to take seriously the allegations of corruption against Viktor Orban and the people from the previous government. Now, and of course, that in itself is no guarantee that that, that Mario Peter is actually going to get any of that money. But nonetheless, he felt that he had to do that. That's well, in order to please Brussels. Now, the reason that they want him to undertake this, joining this prosecutor's office, is that the EU would then be able to send its prosecutors into Hungary and investigate Orban, his friends, and anybody else around him, investigate them in order to prosecute them and in order to ensure that they never return to power. Now, the Hungarian parliament at the moment is quite likely to pass a law on term limits. So basically, the term limits, which is 2 terms. So no one can be prime minister for more than 2 terms. Orban, who has already been prime minister for 5 terms, which means, he was, one term was between 98 and 2002, and then he came back in 2010. And so from 2010 to 2026, that's 4 terms. So 4 plus 1, he's now been prime minister for 5 terms. And so with this constitutional amendment, that will prevent Orban from coming back. Now, of course, in itself is quite ridiculous, because the principle of term limits doesn't really make any sense under a parliamentary system, because under a parliamentary system, um, you have to form governments, you have to form coalition governments, and it just may be that a government can only be formed with a particular leader. If you're going to form coalitions, then coalition members might only serve under a particular leader, and then in any case, if any prime minister, head of government, doesn't meet with the satisfaction of the parliament, then the parliament can just vote him out, and they can just simply say, we have no confidence in this government, and that will be that. So term limits really make very little sense in a parliamentary system. I mean, term limits. I'm against term limits altogether. I don't quite see the point of it. People should be able to vote for whomever. I mean, but if you like this leader, then vote for it. But I mean, the way the term limits work, for instance, in the United States, where you have presidents only have 2 terms, that means that the second term is a complete zero, because essentially any president embarking on his second term is a lame duck, because his term will come to an end. He's not going to seek re-election. The only thing he needs to worry about is, well, what's he going to do after his term in office runs out? So he's basically feathering his nest, making sure that he's got some deals worked out, and so on, which is something like Trump is doing right now. And has to worry about possible prosecution after he's no longer president. So, term limits even under a presidential system don't make a lot of sense. But under a parliamentary system, they've never made any sense. So, I mean, you think of Margaret Thatcher. She served she was 79, 83, 87. So she served 3 terms as prime minister. Tony Blair, 3 terms. Helmut Kohl, Angela Merkel, they all served a number of terms. And whatever you think of any of these political leaders, those they served these terms because they won elections and they were able to command majorities in parliament. But if they couldn't, then they wouldn't be able to serve. Now, this constitutional amendment that Magyar is trying to introduce, the only reason for it is to keep Orban out. He wants to make sure Orban does not come back. The problem with doing it via constitutional amendment, and obviously I think the Europeans sense this, writing these constitutional amendments is awfully easy in Hungary, which means that if you write a constitutional amendment saying no one can serve more than 2 terms as prime minister, well, if the Magyar government adopts this constitutional amendment, then what's to stop the next government from also rewriting the constitution and saying, well, we're canceling that amendment, we've got a new amendment, which is there are no term limits. Which is why the Europeans want something a little bit firmer to ensure that Orban doesn't come back. And I think that's why they want to push ahead with prosecutions. And that's why this was absolutely a condition for Magyar to have any chance of getting any money out of the EU, the absolute condition, which is you join the European Public Prosecutor's Office. Um, so I don't know if that's going to be enough, but the Europeans have seen their power in Hungary, and they're not just going to hand the money over. They want to extract their pound of flesh, and so therefore they're going to want a lot more from Magyar than a commitment to join the public prosecutor's office. So commitments on joining the migration pact, commitments on LGBTQ stuff, and I think also on all kinds of changes in the academic system, and they have a whole list of things of what changes they want from Magyar. So I think he has a long way to get any money. So it's unfortunate that the Hungarians were kind of taken in by the idea that, well, if only we vote out Orban, the EU is going to whip out its checkbook and send us some money. I don't think so. So that's just not the way the EU operates. Anyway, thank you so much, Danaki. And here's was a question from Cynthia. Cynthia, of course, is our film historian, film expert with an extraordinary encyclopedic knowledge of cinema, and who graces us every week with very learned, very insightful commentary about the films that we screen here. And every week we have these part of our movie club. We screen films, and always very good films. And so Gagglers, part of the privilege of joining the Gagglers, get to see outstanding films and get the opportunity to watch the films and enjoy Cynthia's very learned commentary to go with it. So this week, we're screening the Man Who Would Be King, a film made by John Huston in the 1970s with Michael Caine and Sean Connery. Interesting film, not necessarily to everybody's taste, but well worth watching. But above all, well, if you have some difficulties with the history and difficulties understanding what Houston was trying to do in the film, or what indeed Kipling was trying to do with the original short story, then read Cynthia's really interesting observations, and I think you'll learn so much more, not just about the film, but everything to do with the making of the film and with the Kipling story underlying it. So, The Man Who Would Be King, it's there, available on the Gaggle locals page. So, as I say, please join our community. Anyway, Cynthia says, Chas Freeman argues Trump's only off-ramp from the Iran war is forcing Congress to take the blame for the U.S. exit. By letting lawmakers legislate an end, Trump preserves his reputation by claiming Democrats and Congress betrayed him, ruining an imminent victory. The maneuver relies on the classic stab in the back strategy, mirroring how French leaders spun their forced exit from Algeria. Ultimately, the domestic betrayal myth serves as a desperate option to save face. Well, it's interesting. I'm not buying that argument, largely because, irrespective of what Congress does and what Congress votes on, let's say Congress does indeed adopt the War Powers Act, um, that can still be overturned. There was no way, no chance at all that Congress could vote on on a war powers resolution that would withstand a presidential veto. So even if the war powers resolution were to pass, it would go to Trump's desk, and Trump would veto it. So there was no way that Congress could stop um, Trump continuing with the war. So I don't see that argument um, works. I mean, it's just the Congress they don't have the votes to overturn a Trump veto. I so I don't think the stab in the back is going to work here. I mean, I think that um, I mean, yes, of course, he's going to blame the media and so on, but ultimately, it's not Trump's style to embrace failure. I mean, the stab in the back uh, legend works if you admit that you failed. I mean, the classic stab in the back was Germany in 1918. Oh, Germany was could have won the war. Was in a position to win the war, but we were stabbed in the back by our domestic enemies. Um, but in this case, um, Trump he's not going to admit that we failed. Trump is going to say, "Hey, I accomplished everything that I needed to accomplish, and therefore this was a great, fantastic feat on the part of the U.S. military, and especially on my part." Um, so I don't think he can he can really go. I mean, as I said, that's why the it's not what's really happening here isn't to do with the Democrats or the media. He Trump on April the 8th, which is a long time ago now. Um, he's the one who called it off. He called it off. It was long before the War Powers resolution was even discussed. He called it off because he didn't see that his original project, regime change project, maybe, that there was ever any real chance of success. And I think he was shrewd enough to see that continuing with it was not likely to get him achieve any of his goals. So he then decided, well, all right, what what more can I do? Well, I got to find some kind of a formula that I can walk away and claim that I have achieved my goals. And I think I think much more likely than the stab in the back is much more likely will be some claim that he has a deal that's much better than the JCPOA. I mean, I think he's going to do that. Um, so I don't think you know I don't think he's going to admit, which is what the stab in the back legend would have him admit, that he has failed against Iran. That somehow American power was defeated by Iran. I can't see Trump making that claim. And he can't make that claim because he can always veto the war powers resolution. Anyway, thank you um, uh, for that, Cynthia. And also interesting, the Sponlev forced exit from Algeria. Well, that really isn't quite the case in Algeria, because the French actually won that war in Algeria. The De Gaulle decided that he was going to bring this the war, or rather, it was De Gaulle who decided to withdraw France from Algeria, not because France was defeated in Algeria. On the contrary, France won. France defeated the FLN. Um, he said there is no way we can have Algeria as essentially a province of France, because if we do that, we're going to be overrun by Muslims. And so it's like, if you want to retain France as France, then we can't really have Algeria as a department of France, because then these Muslim Algerians are going to come to France and just make France their home. So it's basically, he uh, made clear to the French that, well, if you want to retain France as France, you better let go of Algeria, because otherwise you're going to be overwhelmed by, by Muslim Algerians. And that was how De Gaulle sold his decision, and I think a very reasonable decision, to end French involvement in Algeria. But it wasn't in any way because of a military defeat. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then uh, Robert, always good to see you, Robert. Robert says, yesterday Gilbert Doctorow suggested a Bismarckian endgame for Ukraine. A short, sharp shock followed by Russian funded reconstruction and rapid economic normalization. Doesn't the Franco Prussian War offer the historical template here? Decisive victory, limited aims, and then reintegration rather than endless attritional war. Well, the Franco Prussian War really was a serious problem for Germany. First of all, it wasn't a short, sharp victory. Yes, Prussia defeated France. The Battle of Sedan was a decisive victory for the Prussians. Napoleon III abdicated, but the resistance to Prussia within France continued. So the war wasn't really brought to any kind of a conclusion until much later. There was the Commune. There was essentially it was a very difficult situation for Prussia. So it was many months later until France was ready to come to an agreement with Bismarck. But the problem, particularly for Bismarck, and he said this in later life, was that he felt that he had humiliated France, and that by humiliating France, he had laid the grounds for Germany's subsequent problems, because France was immediately determined to avenge the defeat at the hands of Prussia, and really within, just essentially within a few years, France was making nice with Russia in order to prepare for a two-front war against Germany. So Bismarck himself said that the price he extracted, particularly over Alsace-Lorraine, guaranteed that France would seek to avenge this defeat. And of course it did. Um, so there wasn't a short, sharp defeat. You basically were laying the groundwork for for another war for against Germany. Um, it's just that France had now learned from the defeat of 1870, 1871. France had learned that France is not strong enough by itself to take on Germany. France needs an ally. And Russia was on hand. And from that moment on, Germany realized that, hey, the next war is going to be a two-front war. We're going to have to fight an enemy to the west and an enemy to the east. Now, going back to this case with Russia and Ukraine, there is no way. There's just simply no way that NATO is going to just give up in this way. I mean, idea that oh well, once Ukraine is eliminated, but then NATO will just give up the war, and we're happy to bring in the United Nations, and then they're going to run Ukraine. I mean, this is just fantasy. First of all, I don't believe that Ukraine will collapse even if Zelensky is taken out. There's no evidence that there's no one else other than Zelensky can take over. Um, I don't think that Ukraine sponsors are going to stand by and allow Ukraine to collapse. I think they're going to step in and ensure that there will be a transition to a new leadership, and they're going to make sure that the new leadership will be willing to continue with this fight against Russia. Um, I don't quite see why the same principle that applies in Iran. Well, you take out the entire political and military leadership, and the government doesn't collapse, as it didn't collapse in Iran. But in the case of Ukraine, if you take out Zelensky, then Ukraine just simply collapses. I don't see the argument. Just it just seems to me completely wishful thinking that in Ukraine everything collapses if Zelensky is no longer there. But Iran, however, is able to continue even though its political and military leadership has been taken out. So I don't think it makes any real sense. I don't think NATO has any chance whatsoever. NATO has no intent whatsoever to bring its war against Russia to an end. That's why I think if Zelensky is taken out, then they will find somebody else who would take over, and they would provide him with more protection. So make sure that he isn't taken out by Russia. Um, I mean, I can see the logic of assassinating him. However, I, I, it's a high risk strategy because you simply don't know how the United States might react. The blithe assumption that I think Dr. Rose said, "Oh, Trump will be really happy if they kill Zelensky." I don't know whether they'll be happy with that. Trump might take it as a personal affront if Russia simply takes him out. It's like, well, we Americans can do it. That doesn't mean that you Russians can just simply take out leaders that you don't like, particularly leaders that we support, we bankroll, we have at our meetings. So I don't know, I don't think the Russians are really going to take the risk of taking out Zelensky under the assumption that the United States will just simply sit on its hands. I'm not sure that the United States would do that. I don't think it would be that effective. I think there will be somebody else who could take over from Zelensky. I think NATO will make sure that there's somebody else who can take over from Zelensky. And above all, I don't think Russia's going to do this. I mean, this threat that was issued by Russia a few days ago Well, what's happened about that? I mean, there was, I haven't seen too many attacks since then. I mean, we're used to these familiar threats. Everybody gets very excited. Particularly the world of the alt media. Oh, this is it. This is finally Russia has decided to take action, and now we're going to see some real movement. Um, and then we don't see anything. So it's very. I mean, there's a reason why the Europeans and the Americans took the line that they did when after that warning from the Russian foreign ministry. Well, you better leave Kiev because all hell's going to break loose. And they said, nah, we're not going anywhere. They really don't think Russia's going to do this. They've heard this so many times before. So, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this time it's going to be different. But, there's also a very good chance that it's going to be exactly the same as before. Big talk, big threats, but nothing much, no real follow up. So I still have difficulties seeing the decisive victory from Russia, and that the scenario that you kill Zelensky and the whole place collapses and Russia wins this amazing victory. I, to me, it's just that's just wishful thinking. Maybe that could have worked right at the beginning in 2022 when the war started. Maybe then um, killing Zelensky could have could have been decisive. Because Ukraine was completely caught by surprise. I think NATO was caught by surprise by what Russia did, and they might not have known exactly how to respond to such a decisive action by Russia. But by now, things are very different. I mean, NATO's got its act together, and you know, Ukraine is thoroughly embedded within the NATO structure. So I don't think they're just going to stand by and allow Ukraine to collapse. If there's suddenly going to be some sort of an infighting among Ukraine's leaders as to who takes over from Zelensky, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think NATO would just allow this place to collapse. Anyway, that's my view. Thank you so much, Robert. I really appreciate it. And then here we have Robert says, George, regarding your question on Tuesday, I asked ChatGPT to illustrate what a path 2028 might entail for our former governor. The governor, it's Robert's governor, Chris Christie. Wow. Let's see, Chris Christie. And traffic jam scandal, Bridgegate, lane closures, corruption allegation, close Trump ties, bullying allegation. Is there a path to 2028? Well, I think as we've discussed many times before, the Chris Christie's shot, best shot at the presidency was 2012. I don't know why anyone really thought he would be a particularly attractive leader of the GOP. I guess it was because he had won an election in a blue state. He wins. He's a governor. He's a Republican governor in a blue state, and I guess there's always been this fantasy that oh well, if we can get a governor of a blue state, then then we're going to have a shot at the presidential election. But of course, it doesn't work that way, because there have been many times when Republicans did indeed have a governor of a blue state, but there was never any chance that they could win a national election. Pete Wilson was the governor of California. And there was a lot of talk as well about, hey, well, why don't we have Pete Wilson run as the GOP standard bearer? And that was in preparation of 1996. Until Pete Wilson was told, whatever his talents as governor of California, he was told in a general election, you are not going to carry your own state. You will be absolutely trounced in your own state by Bill Clinton. And that's why Pete Wilson, again, not exactly a particularly sparkling, thrilling personality, but nonetheless, Pete Wilson realized, hey, I don't want to be humiliated in my own state. And so Pete Wilson did not run in 1996. Um, then George Pataki did that as well in 2016. He decided he was going to run in 2016. Hey, well, I'm a three-term governor of New York. Yeah, I mean, you can be a governor, a Republican governor in a blue state like New York. That doesn't mean you have any chance in a national election. And again, Pataki, it was clear to Pataki and to everybody else that in a general election, Pataki, former governor of New York, was not going to carry his own state. And now that's why there was this flurry of excitement, very similar to the cases of Pete Wilson and Pataki, that, well, maybe if we can get Chris Christie, who won in the blue state, maybe that's going to help us against Obama in 2012. Well, um, he I don't think it would have worked, but Chris Christie didn't have the guts to do it. That was, again, it was his best. It was his best shot. He decided not to do it, and then after 2012, then we had Bridgegate and all the other scandals, and suddenly, his image was very much tarnished. So he only ever had that one shot in 2012, and that's what in politics you do only have one shot. It's like Obama. Obama really only had that one shot in 2008. If he hadn't taken that, he probably would never have had another shot. He was fortunate in that nobody knew anything about him, so he was a complete unknown. And he was fortunate he was up against Hillary Clinton, and everybody absolutely hated Hillary Clinton. There was no way in the world the Democrats were going to select Hillary Clinton as a standard bearer. And then he had John Edwards, and then all the sexual scandals around John Edwards. So Obama was just lucky. That was his year. That was his one shot, 2008, and if he hadn't done it then, if he decided, hey, well, this isn't my time, maybe I should wait for the next cycle, he probably would never have been president. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. And then Summer Petrus says, Tony Blair has declared that Keir Starmer is empty politically and espouses no political program. Yeah. However, the vitriol from various liberals his remarks have promoted as to be seen. They especially don't like his association with the Trump Board of Peace. Maybe this is weakness of the liberals. They might fall out amongst themselves over personalities and minor doctrinal differences. Let's hope so. And they send one another to the guillotine. Well, it is interesting. I mean, if you look back on Tony Blair, it's hard to believe that he was indeed the most successful Labour prime minister in Labour Party history, in just in terms of winning elections. Leave aside his policies, and that's a different issue. But in terms of winning, he won re-election in 2001, and then he won again in 2005. And that no Labour prime minister had ever done that. I mean, there've been, Harold Wilson won, I think, 4 elections, but he could never complete a prime ministerial term and get reelected. So Wilson won in 1964. Then basically after 2 years, he called another election, so he won re-election in '66. But in 1970, where he had completed one term, he lost in 1970, and then he returned to power in 1974, but failed to win re-election. Same thing goes for Attlee. The Attlee government failed to win re-election. And then, of course, you had all the problems, back in the 1920s, we had Labour governments collapsing, and then we had the national government, and so on. So, just in terms of political success, Tony Blair can say, "Yeah, I was able to do things that no previous Labour prime minister had accomplished." Now, I think it was a terrible figure. It was a terrible government, and I had very little time for Blair. Now, Blair's position is essentially that Labour has to move to the right. That's it. He makes that very clear in that long, whatever 6,000-word essay. Labour has to end its flirtation with the left. I mean, of course, Keir Starmer is not exactly flirting with the left, but that's the thing. If you want to be successful, you got to abandon your high taxes and high welfare and all that. You gotta move towards a kind of Blairite policy, and that's what Blairism was. Blairism is essentially he adopted Thatcherism for the Labour Party. I actually don't think that would work for Starmer. I think that was a different time. Labour had been out of power when he came to power in 1997. Labour had been out of power in 18 years, and they had been so traumatized by the Thatcher years that they felt, well, the only thing we can do is to somehow embrace some version of Thatcherism for ourselves. I don't think that's going to work this time. And it is true that Blair now he's a rather discredited figure, and of course Iraq has badly damaged his reputation. Now the board of peace it's very interesting that yes, you got the figures on the left who don't like his association with the board of peace because they don't like Trump. It is interesting that when it comes to foreign policy, Blair criticizes Starmer on the one policy that I think Starmer has been, not unreasonable on, which is staying out of Trump's wars. So there, Blair takes objection. Oh no, you should have supported, the war in Iran. I mean, Blair actually Starmer pursued a reasonable policy there. But it's interesting that that Blair did not address the issue of Russia and Ukraine, and that's how disastrous the Starmer policy has been there on that issue, and all the Guardian types and everyone who's now attacking Blair, they're all on board. They're all on board for this. Yeah, I've got to, this is great. This the Ukraine policy is absolutely fantastic. Yet this has been, a terrible policy. But it's kind of interesting that Blair takes issue with Starmer, always insufficiently pro-Trump, understandably, the Guardian and the rest, they don't like Blair for that, but Guardian, Blair, Starmer, they're all on board for the Russia and Ukraine policy. So I don't think Blair has any real influence anymore. I think it's like the Blair era has come and gone, and it's like, oh, it's almost like a museum piece, remembering the Blair years, which are now almost 30 years ago with the heyday of Blair. So anyway, thank you so much, Summer Petros. And then Ivan Grozny, good to see you back. He says, see you, George. What's your favorite kind of beer? My favorite kind of beer is Czech beer. I like Pilsner. Most beers I don't like, but I have, I do love the Czech Pilsner beer. I like that um, bitter, refreshing taste. So, anyway, thank you for asking. And my time is up. Thank you very much, everybody who had joined me. I really appreciate it. Sorry for the late start. And we're going to do some podcasts over the weekend. And then next Monday, we'll have a live stream with Peter. And then next Tuesday, it'll be time for my solo. I hope to see you all then. Until then, all the best. Good night.